Welcome to Students Over Systems, where we talk with the creators, advocates, and beneficiaries of education freedom. I'm your host, Jenny Gentles. On today's episode, we're going to talk about open enrollment, attendance zones, and redlining. For this important discussion, we're joined by Tim DeRoche, author of A Fine Line, How Most American Kids Are Kept Out of the Best Public Schools. The book examines the laws and policies that dictate which kids are allowed to go to which public schools. Tim is also founder and president of Available to All, an organization dedicated to ensuring that all public schools are available to all on equal terms. Tim, thank you for joining us on Students Over Systems.
Thanks for having me, Ginny.
Tim, let's start with the basics. What are school attendance zones?
So school attendance zones are lines drawn by a school district to determine who is eligible or not eligible to attend given public school. So I learned about these lines because in my old neighborhood of Los Angeles, there was one coveted public elementary school up on the hill. And all the chatter in the neighborhood was, how do we get our kids into Mount Washington Elementary, this one coveted public school up on the hill? And the way you did that is you bought a home in this very gerrymandered attendance zone that the district had drawn decades ago. And so this is the other type of line that determines who can go to schools or who can't go to schools. There's often a lot of talk about district boundaries, right? The lines between one district and another. And those are very, very important. But this is another type of line that kind of restricts educational access for many American families.
I know we have some listeners in Canada, and I did work in education policy up there. I think that they call them catchment zones or something like that.
Yeah, in some places they call them catchment areas. So if you look at the laws that govern this kind of thing, in some places they're just called attendance zones. In some places they're called attendance areas. In other places they're called catchment areas. But it's all a way of saying the district is deciding who goes to which school, right? They're assigning kids based on where they live, which means that only the wealthiest families are going to get to send their kids to these really coveted public schools.
Right. So families buy in with their homes. All right. So you've written, in many cases, a child's educational fate is being determined when they're 5 years old based on whether they live on one side of the street or the other side of the street. So let's dig in a little bit.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is these kids are being sorted into winners and losers when they're 5 years old. So you see examples like in my old neighborhood, you know, a kid on one side of the street is assigned to one of these coveted public schools that has, you know, where 75% of the kids are reading proficiently. And then on the other side of the line, on the other side of the street, their playmate, who they've been playing with since they were 2, is sent to a school where only 16% of the kids can read. And when the stakes are that high, you mentioned it just a second ago, the families are willing to pay quite a bit of money to buy into that zone. And so what this does is this contributes to the housing, the affordable housing crisis, in that it drives up real estate costs. So we have examples from Tampa, from Los Angeles, where, you know, anecdotal evidence that families are paying $300,000 extra to live in one of these coveted zones. And so that is often the real price of a public education that is supposed to be free, right? The price of this high quality public education is hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's not a just way to do it. It's not an efficient way to do it, and we're arguing that we need to reform those laws and open up those schools to more kids.
Well, it's interesting. I've lived in the Northern Virginia area for a good chunk of my adult life. And I remember at one point noticing that people talk about living in North Arlington. They don't just say that they live in Arlington County. They say North Arlington. Yep. And I think that might have been just a way to signal I paid more than $300,000 more for my house than if I lived in South Arlington. I have chosen to send my kids to quote unquote good schools. So it does kind of become a lifestyle choice and identity and a point of pride. That's something maybe people aren't thinking through. Well, what are the consequences for those kids in South Arlington?
It's become a part of the way that we do this in the United States, and it's sort of a part of the way we think. Everyone just defaults. I'm going to send the kid. I'm going to buy a home where everybody else lives like me. If I'm a wealthy person, I'm going to overpay for a house in one of these zones. And really, we believe this is hurting everyone, right? This isn't just hurting the low income kids who are kept out of those public schools. We believe this is hurting the wealthier families who have to buy a home bundled with the school. So in other words, I've talked to several families where they bought a home, they stretched financially to buy a home in one of these coveted zones and ended up with a big mortgage. And then their kids got to junior high and they're like, this school isn't the best fit for my kid, right? I want the kid to go to a different school, but now they're burdened with this mortgage. They're still burdened with this mortgage. They overpaid, and their options are kind of limited. They're kind of boxed in, and so and they shouldn't have had to pay that much anyway. You shouldn't have to pay $300,000 to a homeowner, right? Just to get access to a specific school. It's a screwy way to do it. And we think as more and more people pay attention, right? A lot of people just don't even know this is going on. It's sort of a part of the background noise. But I think when people start to pay attention, they start to see that it's a very inefficient way to run a system that does not, it doesn't guarantee equal access. It doesn't result in good outcomes for kids.
Well, I want to get more into the history of how we got to this point, and then also maybe dig into some specific stories of families impacted by the policies. But I do want to just go ahead and skip ahead to the solution so that we can start feeling hopeful that there's something that can be done here. We don't want to just say, well, this is how it's done in North America. That's that. So you've said that Available to All, the organization that you've founded and lead, that you don't believe in redrawing the lines. We believe in getting rid of them. Geography is an archaic and discriminatory way of determining who goes where. Okay, Tim, how in the world, after all of these decades of the system being the way that it is, do we get rid of the lines? And then related to that, how does that impact the housing market that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're working towards a future, whether it's 20 or 30 years down the line, where no kid can be turned away from a quote unquote public school because of their address, right? We just believe that's fundamentally morally wrong. It's not consistent with the kind of the mission of public education. It's not consistent with the principles that our country was founded on, including equal protection under the law. But that said, it is hard to get there from where we are. There are certain folks who are very invested in these lines. So we're arguing for kind of common sense changes that will move us in the right direction. One of the biggest ones that I'm a fan of is, a 15% reserve policy. So every public school would have to reserve 15% of its seats for kids who live outside the zone or the district. Now, this is going to impact a very small number of schools, right? Most schools have space, right? There's overcapacity in the system. There's always been overcapacity in the system.
Well, especially now, because we have
a
baby bust, we have fewer K-12 students overall, and then maybe an increase in the number of students choosing schools or options outside the public system. But that decline in enrollment perhaps provides more of an opportunity for this than ever before.
It does. And so really a 15% reserve would affect really a small number of schools. It's eminently reasonable. You would still allow that school to retain its character, but say, hey, these are public schools. We got to open up to people who, don't just live in this little gerrymandered area. So that's one thing we advocate for. We talk about open enrollment reform, but there are lots of states that don't have open enrollment at all, which open enrollment is a policy whereby children or families can apply to go to a school that they aren't zoned to, whether it's across a attendance zone line or it's across district boundaries. They can apply to some other schools. But the reforms that we want to open enrollment I think we need to start thinking of open enrollment as a civil rights issue, right? Not as just a program. In many states, it's just a program. Districts can volunteer. They can opt in or opt out if they want to. It serves a very small population. And I think we need kind of an open enrollment revolution in thinking about it in terms of civil rights. Like we're taxpayers, right? We're paying into these systems, and then you're telling us we can't go to certain of these schools. We think every American kid should be able to apply to any public school, right? The district should be required to issue a formal denial letter, right? And saying what is the basis for that. And then the school should have to publish their acceptance and denial rates, right? No state currently requires these public schools to publish their acceptance and denial rates. And right now, a lot of these schools, they just, even if you live a half a mile away, if you're on the wrong side of the line, they just say, well, you don't even have to apply. We're not going to allow you to apply because we have no legal obligation to you, even if you're a taxpayer in that district. And so that's a system that's ripe for abuse. And I think it has been abuse going on. And we all know of schools that kind of allow people selectively to break these rules. In our old neighborhood, there was one of our neighbors who came and said, oh, we got our kid into Mount Washington, and they did not live in that zone. And everybody was like, well, how the heck did that happen? There was some sweet talking going on, and it worked. They're letting in certain people and not letting in others. There's a lot of discretion. We need more oversight.
Talk a little bit more about the impact on the housing market. I feel like in my area, the pushback would be, well, we spent a lot to have this house in this attendance zone, and now you're saying you want to carve out a portion of our school for other students, or you want to do away with boundaries altogether. How is that going to impact my financial future? So what is your response to people who are concerned about losing value in their homes if this is the policy?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. I'm a homeowner, and we actually have a house in one of these coveted zones. But what I would say is we don't want to distort the real estate market any more than it's already distorted. We don't want to drive up real estate costs. All of us have an interest, especially if we have children, if we want to have grandchildren. We want real estate to be affordable. We want young families to be able to purchase homes. And we have these policies that drive up home prices. And I'm sympathetic to people who bought the home based on these prices, but I don't on these policies. But if your home price is wrapped up in excluding other people from attending your quote unquote public school, I just don't think that that's consistent with the American social contract. I don't think it's consistent with the purpose of the public schools. And I think we have to have sympathy for those folks, but I also think we have to move towards fair and just policies, regardless of the impact on individual, the home prices of individual families, right? We need to do what's right for our society as a whole, and not use the government to kind of protect special interests.
So you were talking about different policy solutions. One is the reserving 15% of the seats for students that might be outside the attendance zone.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate goal is erasing the boundaries altogether. I would say that some districts would say, or states would say, well, we have open enrollment and we have this flexibility that you're talking about. But I've seen some analysis, again, in my area, that says I'd have to pay more for my daughter to attend the school district that is adjacent to mine within a mile here than I do for her to attend the Catholic school that she attends.
Yep.
So is that common where you have to pay a decent amount of essentially public school tuition in order to take advantage of open enrollment policies?
Yeah, there are a number of states, and the Reason Foundation's done great research on this, where the district is allowed to charge tuition, right, to kids who come from out of the district. So, I mean, what you're really highlighting is, and that's just fundamentally unfair, right? What you're really highlighting is the need for transportability of funding, right? So if someone finds a public school that's the right fit for their kid, the funding for that child should follow that child to the new school, right? It's not owned by the district or the system, right, where they were assigned. It should follow them, and I think that's a much better way. As your podcast title suggests, we should be funding this. The funding is for the students, right? The funding is not for the system. The funding is not for this big bureaucracy. The funding is meant to help individual students, individual American families, and so funding that follows the kid, and getting rid of this policy whereby public school districts can charge tuition, I think is the right thing to do.
When you're talking about absolutely immense school districts like Florida, I'm pretty sure Florida only has 67 school districts.
Yeah.
So Orange County, where I grew up, it was huge, and they had magnet programs. But those kids had to get up so early to get on a bus to go to another high school across town if they were taking advantage of the magnet program. And I'm sure that's still the case.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, how does transportation work in the world that you're talking about? I mean, there's the distance that can come, and then just the logistical complications, which seem to overwhelm school districts at the beginning of a school year under normal circumstances. Do you all delve into that at Available to All?
So, we believe in help for kids with transportation, but we are about civil rights, right? Available to All is focused on this fundamental civil rights question of equal access to public schools. So, transportation is a policy issue that is downstream of that fundamental civil rights issue. So, we're certainly a fan of districts that try to subsidize transportation, that try to figure these things out. But our point is, it's not always the most convenient thing for a family to send their kid to the school, right down the street, or the one that they've been assigned to, which in some cases has been gerrymandered. So they're quite a ways from that school. So if you can get your kid to a school, we believe, right, then you deserve an equal right to go to that public school. So again, we're fans of the transportation, but that is not our wheelhouse of figuring out the transportation issues. We just think civil rights, the civil rights lens, and making sure that all kids have equal access to public schools. Like think of a low income family. Maybe the mom works as a house cleaner, right, in a more upscale part of town. Every day she's traveling to this part of town. She could drop her kids off at that school, right, at the school in that wealthier neighborhood. And right now she's prevented from doing that. She doesn't need transportation help, right? There are lots of other examples, right? Maybe the grandparent lives in the, in a better school district or in a better school zone. Why can't we, and the kids could be dropped off at the grandma's. So there are lots of examples. I think if these schools had policies whereby they had to accept these kids, then families would figure out the logistics. And certainly if the school district could help provide transportation options, a subsidy, then wonderful. But I think you'd find that many, many families are going to figure out ways to get their kids to these high quality schools if they're allowed in. Right now, we're using government policy to lock those kids out.
Well, all that certainly tracks if you think about the millions of families that are taking advantage of scholarship programs or ESAs. They managed to figure out how to get their children to schools outside of the public school, residentially assigned school. Okay, you mentioned families who might want to use the school near a grandparent.
Yeah.
And that has happened historically, where families might use a grandparent's address, an aunt's address, another address. But there's a shocking number of states that view that as a criminal offense. Has that been a part of your, I guess, storytelling or analysis as you've looked into this issue?
It has, as you know, Ginny, we work with Kelly Williams Bolar. She's our parent liaison, and Kelly was put in jail for using her dad's address. Her dad lived 10 minutes away. Her dad was a homeowner, so built a home, right? Increased the tax base in this district, was paying taxes into this district, this wealthy suburban district in Akron, Ohio, and Kelly was working in the Akron public schools and said, these schools are not safe. I don't want my daughters in these schools. So she used her dad's address. He was helping out with childcare. They were over there all the time. And, the district hired a private investigator, followed her around, said, hey, you live 10 minutes away. You live on the wrong side of the line, kicked your kids out of school. And then 18 months later, filed charges against her, try and make an example out of her. And so Kelly's been very brave in telling this story, and her story really highlights the injustice, right? Her kids were locked out of a high quality school 10 minutes away. Her daughters were thriving at that school, right? They were thriving at that school, and yet the school kicked them out. So We published a report last year calling for the decriminalization of address sharing. This is something that goes on up and down the economic spectrum. I was talking to a friend who grew up in Malibu, and her parents like paid a neighbor for their gas bill to enroll her in a different high school because they thought it was a better fit for her. So this goes on up and down the economic spectrum. I think all of us know somebody who's done this, or perhaps we've done it ourselves. And it's very, very selectively enforced, right? It's enforced when the district wants to, maybe make an example out of someone. I think it's enforced on low-income people of color more frequently than others. So it's just a way for this injustice to be carried forward, and we argue, hey, this is a very common practice. We shouldn't outlaw it. We shouldn't criminalize it and put parents in jail for this.
Okay, well, there's so many aspects of this that are so unjust, and one of those is the districts, again, that say, oh, well, we have open enrollment policies, but they discriminate against students with disabilities. Can you tell me a little bit about that phenomenon?
Yeah, there are a couple examples. So both Arizona and Wisconsin have pretty robust open enrollment, and they've seen dramatic increases in kids crossing district lines to attend schools that they think are a good fit. However, those laws are not perfect, right? In both Arizona and Wisconsin, there's sort of a categorical right of the district to say no to a child with disabilities, right? All they have to say is our special education program is full, but they don't have to provide any verification of that. So they can just say no. And so we've just got these heartbreaking examples of families, kids being excluded from schools because they have a disability, which just seems fundamentally wrong. But it's perfectly allowed by the law. The Wisconsin Supreme Court said, we don't love this law, but this is how the law is written. And so, yes, school districts can say no to these kids and they can turn them away.
Well, you were talking about a lot of this being a civil rights issue. It does seem, with there being a federal law that guarantees free, appropriate public education, and that's IDEA,
Yep.
that somehow that fact that, at your very core, well, gosh, that's wrong. Also, it seems like federally that would be viewed as wrong. So hopefully that's something that can be explored in the future as part of this endeavor. Let's go back a little bit and talk about the historical underpinnings of this. What is redlining, and what does it have to do with what we're talking about today?
Yeah, redlining was something that took place in the New Deal era, right? The government had passed all of these housing assistance programs, and there wasn't enough to go around. Everybody, they couldn't give money to everybody, so they determined eligibility by drawing these maps. And what they did is for every major American city, this government agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, drew these maps showing which areas were desirable, which areas were best, which areas were declining, and which areas were hazardous. And so the hazardous areas were shaded red. These were areas with large percentages of people of color, especially African Americans, low-income folks, immigrants. And these maps basically determined whether you were eligible for this housing assistance, and those folks who lived in those red areas were declared to be ineligible. So what's going on right now in the education system, our K-12 education system, is very, very similar, right? We've got these exclusionary maps that determine who is or isn't eligible to go to these coveted public schools. And so for my book, one of the things we did is we kind of overlaid these attendance zones of these coveted schools in the city centers of many cities, and we overlaid them on the old redlining maps, which are like 80, 90 years old. And what you can see is there's still, right, they're covering the part of town, considered best or desirable back in the 1930s, and they're still excluding those parts of town where the working class folks live, where the people of color live, where the immigrants live. And so they're really doing the same job as these redlining maps from the 30s. And as a country, we still haven't kind of reckoned with this. I'm doing my best to get the word out and to publish more maps showing that this is true across the country. This is not a problem specific to one part of the country, right? We've got southern states, we've got northeastern states, we've got midwestern states, we've got western states, where you can see clearly these maps are excluding low-income kids from the best public schools, and it's being enforced by government policy.
Tell us a little bit about the origin story of the name of your organization, Available to All.
Yeah, so we take our name from the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. This was almost 70 years ago now. This is the in May we're going to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Ed, which outlawed explicit racial segregation. Right? Brown said, "Hey, you can't sort kids by race into public schools. Separate but equal is not okay." And as a part of that ruling, Chief Justice Warren wrote that the public schools must be, quote unquote, available to all on equal terms. And I think we have failed as a country to live up to that promise. The courts got very concerned after Brown. The desegregation lawsuits that came afterward got very focused on eradicating explicit racial segregation in the southern districts, which was an urgent problem and necessary, but they never came back around to provide the types of protections that all American families need, right? That to ensure that the public schools are available to all on equal terms. And so basically, it's perfectly legal for districts to discriminate against you based on where you live, to say you can or can't attend this school based on where you live. The dirty secret of magnet school admissions is that many magnet schools have enrollment preferences for wealthy people, right? They're trying to get their racial mix right? They were founded to combat segregation and racial division. So they're trying to draw in white families, and they think they can't give an enrollment preference to white families though. So what they do is they give an enrollment preference to wealthy families, assuming that those families are white. But the great irony of the magnet schools is, hey, these were schools created to give better opportunities for low-income kids, and they have blatant, explicit enrollment policies that prefer wealthy families. It's easier to get into these magnet schools if you're wealthy than if you're poor. So the laws have not protected American families as a whole. And so we're really arguing that we need to fulfill that original promise of the Brown ruling, that schools have to be available to all on equal terms.
Right. And for more information on your organization, people can go to available2all.org and also read your book, which is called A Fine Line, I believe.
Yep. A Fine Line, How Most American Kids Are Kept Out of the Best Public Schools. Yeah, that's really where the whole organization came from. My kind of digging into what I was seeing in our old neighborhood and kind of looking for that pattern around the country.
Yeah, and those maps are really powerful. I think my awakening to this issue began when I first started seeing those maps come out. So,
that's great.
Thank you for that visual and thoughtful way of contributing to this conversation. I think sometimes people just need to see it to believe and really understand what's going on.
Yep.
Okay, last question on the Students Over Systems podcast is always, what is the school choice myth that bothers you the most and that you want to dispel today?
Yeah, I think school choice gets framed as like it gets framed as private school choice, charter schools. Our focus at Available to All is really access to public schools, right? Like if you believe that one public school is a better fit for your kid than another, we believe that you should have equal access to that school. It's a public school. And right now, that's not the case. So we want to make sure that all American families have access to these great public schools, and it's sort of a myth that school choice only covers charters and private school choice. We want to focus on open enrollment and public schools.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for joining me today and for your advocacy for public schools to be available to all students on equal terms.
Thank you, Jenny. Really enjoyed it.
We hope listeners found today's conversation informative and encouraging. If you enjoyed this episode of Students Over Systems, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends. To learn more about the work of the IWF Education Freedom Center, please visit iwf.org/EFC. Thank you for listening to Students Over Systems. Until next time, keep celebrating education freedom and brighter futures.